Hi, fellow believers in Christ. I got a new computer and I'm learning how to use it. And so now I can actually do slideshow presentations, which it's good that I can do that because this video has a lot of kind of complicated information in it. So it'll actually be better in a slideshow. So I praise the Lord for that. And I'll just get started. Last week, Jesus told me something about himself, and it's not because I'm special. Jesus never tells us stuff because we're special. It's because he's special, and he shares things about himself with us. He reveals things about himself to us. So when you're walking in obedience and you're serving him and you're listening to him, occasionally he'll tell you something about himself, and it's just a wonderful thing. It always blows me away whenever Jesus tells me something. So it has nothing to do with me being special because he's going to tell you things as well that he hasn't told me. Anyway, so Jesus speaks into our hearts directly, and I'm sure that he's already told you things that he's never told me, and that as you continue walking with him, he will tell you things, and that you can share with other people or you can keep it to yourself depending on why Jesus told you. But last week he told me something really interesting about himself. You know how I told you in our previous video that the Shroud of Turin is real? And I also talked in another video about how Jesus did have shoulder length hair. And what Jesus told me last week is the reason that he had shoulder length hair when he died and when he arose again is because he never got his hair cut during his entire ministry. It was actually just below the shoulders. Jesus never got his haircut from the point that his ministry began, from the point he left home. And that was what he told me last week. And so you'll see in a little while why he told me that. But I believe, number one, it was to remind me of something that my mom had told me about 3 years ago, because my mom does a lot of different Bible studies. And she had come across this Bible study online, and it explained that the ministry of Jesus was not 3.5 years long, as we've all been told in church our whole lives. The ministry of Jesus was 70 weeks long, not 3.5 years. And so let's go back to the hair, and then I will talk more about the ministry of Jesus. Hair, I looked up on the internet, and hair grows about 1.5, it grows about 1/2 inch a month. Okay. And Jesus' ministry, if it was 70 weeks long, it was 16 months long. That's 1 year and 4 months. So it's just under 1.5 years. So in that length of time, your hair would grow about 8 inches. Okay. And so that's why Jesus told me last week that the reason his hair was just below the shoulders was because he never got it cut from the time he left home and began his ministry. And several years ago, even before I became born again, Jesus told me that when he left home with nothing but the clothes that he was wearing and the shoes on his feet. He didn't take any money when he left home. He didn't take a knapsack of food. He didn't take extra clothes. He didn't take anything. He just left home with the clothes that he was wearing and the shoes that he was wearing. And that was it. And so that's why when Jesus sent out the disciples and when he sent out the 70, that he told them not to take anything extra with them, not to take money, not to take extra shoes, not to take an extra coat, just to go out as they were. He wanted them to practice what he had done himself, which was relying on the Father to provide for their every need. And so the reason Jesus stopped getting his hair cut when he left home was because he was relying on the Father to provide for his every need. And he wasn't spending any money on luxuries like a haircut. That became a luxury at that point once he began his ministry, and it was a luxury he didn't need. So that showed me something I have never known before. Because I've always wondered about Jesus and his hair, like how often did he get it cut? Who cut it? But now I know that Jesus kept his hair short his whole life until his ministry began, and then that was when he stopped taking care of his own personal needs, and he was just relying on the Father to take care of all of his needs at that point. And so Jesus kept his hair short, just like most men do. But it grew out because he wasn't getting haircuts. Well, anyway, moving on. I just think that's really beautiful. It just shows the sacrifices. Jesus made a lot of massive sacrifices, but that was one little tiny sacrifice that he made. And the Shroud of Turin shows that Jesus' hair was shoulder length. Now, on the shroud, his hair is higher, a little bit higher than the shoulder, but he was entombed face down. And if you're laying face down, your hair is going to go forward and be elevated. Plus, when the image on the shroud was made, when it was burned into the shroud, his body was elevated even more because he was in the process of resurrecting. So his body was even more elevated, which would make his hair seem even shorter. But even on the shroud, you can see that his hair is below the ears and above the shoulders, but it was elevated. So if he had been standing upright, his hair would have been just below the shoulders. So it wasn't Jesus' custom to have his hair grown out below the shoulders. It just happened during his ministry because he wasn't getting haircuts. So the program that my mom watched that taught her that Jesus' ministry was 70 weeks long is this program called Rude Awakening. And the man who does the show, his name is Michael Rood. So you can look him up and you can watch his show yourself. But I knew two things as soon as my mom told me this. And this was even before I became born again. No, wait, it might have been right after I became born again. Yeah, it was. I knew two things right off the bat. Number one, the word rood means Holy Cross of Christ, the cross that Jesus died on. That's a Middle English word for the cross that Jesus died on. And so I thought it was real interesting that a man who talks about the life of Jesus, his last name is R-O-O-D, Rood. I thought that was pretty interesting and not coincidental. But the other thing I realized right off the bat is that what the man was teaching must be true, because up to that point in my life, I had already read the Bible like at least 26 times. And so I had always known that the Gospels don't read like a 3-year story. They read more like a 1.5-year story. But I had always just taken for granted that what I heard in church was true, that Jesus' ministry was 3 years or 3.5 years. And so I never thought about it. But as soon as my mom told me about this show, I was like, oh, that makes sense. Now it makes sense why the gospel never reads like it's 3 years. It always reads like 1.5 years, because it is 1.5 years. His ministry really was 1.5 years. So I had never done that research on my own. And to this day, I've never watched that program. But I believe with all my heart that it's true that Jesus' ministry was 70 weeks. Okay, so moving on. In Matthew 3, verse 13, we see that Jesus was baptized. And immediately after he was baptized by John the Baptist, he went into the mountain. Now, I believe he went to a mountain to fast for 40 days because in many places in the Bible, you'll find that whenever Jesus tries to get away from people, he always goes on a mountain, including the Garden of Gethsemane. That was a small mountain. Jesus always liked to go on mountains to pray. And I know why that was too, because I used to live in mountainous country, and where I live now, it's all flat, but I used to live in the mountains. And the higher up you go, the less people are there. And that's just a rule of nature. You're going to have less people the higher you go. And so I think that's why Jesus always went on a mountain to fast, because he wanted to be alone. And that was a way of getting away from people. So anyway, he went on the mountain for 40 days, which translates into 5.71 weeks. But when in the calendar year did his fast begin? That was my first question. And I didn't start doing my own research until just a few days ago. And the reason I started doing that was because last week Jesus told me about his hair. And that was what got me started. And it made me decide to do my own research on the 70 weeks so I could do this presentation for you, because evidently I believe Jesus wants you to know about this. And I already knew when my mom told me, but I never did research on it. But I think Jesus wants you to know this. And so that's why he reminded me about his hair, or he told me about his hair, was to remind me that his ministry was 70 weeks long. So then that prompted me to share this with you. So he must want you to know about this. Okay. In Luke 6, verse 1, it says, and it came to pass on the first Sabbath. Now, that's not any old Sabbath. There are many Sabbaths in the Jewish calendar, and I am not an expert at all on the Jewish calendar. I'm not even going to pretend to be. I had to do research on the Jewish calendar to make this presentation, and I'm still not an expert on it. So you can go research it yourself and probably figure this out better than I did. But the first Sabbath is a specific Sabbath in the calendar year. It's not any old Sabbath. And as he's going through the cornfields, that was when his disciples were plucking the ears. And then they were criticized by the Pharisees for doing work on the Sabbath, which was plucking the corn. That was considered work by the Pharisees. And so they said, you can't do work on the Sabbath, even if you're starving to death. You just have to go hungry. And that was the Pharisees' ridiculous argument. Well, anyway, so that was in Luke 6, verse 1, that mentions the first Sabbath. So what is the first Sabbath? I went to this website and got a good definition of it. This is the correct definition. The first Sabbath after the second day of Passover. So at this point in John chapter 6, the first Passover of Jesus' ministry has begun. That feast has already begun. Okay, and this is that Sabbath in which they were walking around plucking the ears of corn and eating them. So it says, the first of the 7 Sabbaths, the Hebrews were to count unto themselves from the morrow after the Sabbath, in order to know when Pentecost occurs. So after Jesus was at some point in Jesus' ministry, after his ministry began, a Passover had occurred. And that's the Passover that's the first Passover mentioned in the Gospels. And that's the Passover in which he went to the temple and overthrew all the money changers and everything. But when they were plucking the ears of corn, that was the first Sabbath that they were supposed to count until Pentecost. So there was a Passover, and followed by a Pentecost near the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Okay. And this law is in Luke 23:15. So we'll go to that now. And this is about the Festival of Weeks. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks. Okay, so this is talking about the weeks between, as I understand it, the weeks between Passover and Pentecost, what we call Pentecost. Okay. In Matthew chapter 14, which is near the end of Jesus, which is near the closer to the end than the beginning of Jesus' ministry, it says that John the Baptist was killed on Herod's birthday. But my question when I started the research is, when was Herod's birthday in the calendar year? Because I want to know when in the calendar year, and in other words, when on the calendar of Jesus' ministry did John the Baptist actually die? Did he get murdered? So we'll come back to that too. So John 8, verse 12 is Hanukkah time. And that is when Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Okay. And that's when he told them he's the light of the world. Now, he told them during the time when they were all lighting the lights, because in Hanukkah, today they have a menorah with candles on it, and they light the candles one each day. And in the olden days, they had lamps that they lit one each day. And so that's how it's called the Festival of Lights. Well, during the Festival of Lights is when Jesus proclaimed, I am the light of the world. So they knew what he was talking about. And he was saying, this whole Hanukkah thing is all about me. Everything that you celebrate is all about me. And I am the light of the world. I'm not just a little, lamp light. I am the light, he was telling them. In Luke 24, verse 1 and 2, this is talking about after Jesus died on the cross and the day that the women came to the tomb to minister to the dead body of Jesus, but it turned out his body wasn't there and he wasn't dead. And here it says, on the first of the Sabbaths at early dawn. Now, this again is not any old Sabbath. This is a specific Sabbath in the calendar year. They came to the tomb bearing the spices. And of course, they didn't find Jesus. Okay. So this was the first of the Sabbaths. So what does that mean? Because it's not any old Sabbath. So I went to this website and got a really good definition. The Greek is commonly first of the Sabbaths and refers to the wave sheaf day, which began the counting toward Pentecost. Now, again, this is the second Passover in Jesus' ministry, and this is the Passover in which he was crucified, and followed by the second Pentecost in Jesus' ministry, which will be followed by the second Pentecost in Jesus' ministry, which is after he resurrected and went to heaven, and the tongues of fire fell on his 120 disciples that were waiting for the Holy Spirit to baptize them. So this is the second Sabbath and Pentecost of Jesus' ministry. So it says, in other words, the notion Sabbaths connects back to the first form of Sabbaths discussed under point 1 above, which I haven't read to you, a specific set of weekly Sabbaths defining the period between the first and third month assemblies. Okay. So again, this is talking about, and that's why it comes late. Let me go back up there. It comes late in the book of Luke. It comes in chapter 24 because this is the second Sabbath where, it's the second Passover time where Jesus was crucified. That's why it's late in Luke and not early. Okay, so Luke chapter 4. Now this is early in Luke. So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the day of Sabbaths, not the Sabbath day, and stood up to read. Again, this is talking about a specific Sabbath in the calendar year. And this and the website, which is the same website that I showed you on the previous slide, it says this term, Day of the Sabbaths, could refer either to the wave sheaf day, the first day of the Sabbaths period, or Pentecost itself, the last day of the Sabbaths period. Now, this is talking about the first Sabbath and the first Passover and the first Pentecost in Jesus' ministry. Okay. And I believe we'll find later that John the Baptist was still alive during that time. Yeah, he was still alive during the first Passover of Jesus Christ's ministry. And we'll get more about that later. Okay, so a reference to the period of the 7 Sabbaths, and this is still that same website that I showed you before. A reference to the period of the 7 Sabbaths between the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Pentecost. And this is where you find it in different places in the gospel. But these words Sabbath all refer to this one of the 7 Sabbaths or these 7 Sabbaths between Passover and Pentecost. Okay, it's not just any old Sabbath in the calendar. It's a specific set of 7 that come in that time frame of the calendar. So that's around it's around March, April, those months. On the Gentile calendar, it would be March, April. Okay. So Luke 4:31, then he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and was teaching them in the Sabbaths. Mark 1:21, then he went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbaths he entered the synagogue and taught. And again, all these Sabbaths are between Passover and Pentecost. Mark 2:23, this is all talking about the same time frame. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbaths, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. Matthew 12:1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbaths, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And Luke 13:10. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbaths. All same time frame. So this is early in Jesus' ministry. And as you can see, all those verses are early except for the Matthew 12. All those verses fall early in the Gospels. So actually Matthew 12 and Luke 13, but Matthew has one of the longest renditions of the Gospels, so that could explain why it's Matthew 12, because in the book of Matthew 12 would be early in Jesus' ministry, because Matthew 24 is late in Jesus' ministry. So that explains. Matthew and Luke are probably the longer renditions. So, but going back to Luke 6:1, and okay, so it says, now it happened on the Sabbath second foremost that he went through the grain fields. Okay, so again, it's a specific Sabbath, and it says and I think this is all from the same website, okay? In the context of the period of the 7 weekly Sabbaths, there is a weekly Sabbath which precedes the wave sheaf ceremony. Again, it's the same information. It immediately precedes the counting of the days toward the Feast of Weeks. Therefore, it seems logical that this weekly Sabbath be identified in this context as Sabbath foremost. Hence the expression Sabbath second foremost, apparently meaning Sabbath second to the foremost would be identifying the next weekly Sabbath. That is the first of the 7 weekly Sabbaths. It's really complicated to me because I haven't been raised as a Jew practicing all the Jewish festivals. So to me, it's complicated, but I do understand that each Sabbath on the calendar year is a different Sabbath. They're not all the same. Okay. So if you can at least understand that much that I understand, then we're on the same page. But the Jews who celebrate the feasts every year, they understand this a lot better, and this makes even more sense to them. Okay, so John 6:4 is the second of, now this is where I kind of threw all my papers down and felt really awful. Because in John 6:4, I was going over the book of John, and I found 3 Passovers mentioned in the book of John, which throws that 70-week theory out the window. Because if there's 3 Passovers, that would mean that Jesus' ministry was 2.5 years long, not 1.5 years long, 2.5 years long. Because to have 3 Passovers, that would be 2.5 years. There's 2 good news about this. One of them is that it's still not 3.5 years. Okay, so it's definitely, no gospel supports a 3.5 year ministry time frame. However, mentioning 3 Passovers is a massive problem. And I got really discouraged for a minute there. And I was like going to just not even give this presentation. And then I decided, hey, I think for once in my life, I'll look up what Rude says about this. Because I'd never seen his program. I found a web page that explains what he says. He says John 6:4 mentions that Passover was nigh, but that's impossible. Passover is in the spring, and this verse comes on the heels of the feeding of the 5,000, which is true, which occurred in late summer. If anything, it should have referenced the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs in autumn. Now that makes sense, because when I was reading the book of John last night to kind of finalize this presentation, and I came up to this second of 3rd Passovers, I was expecting it to come up to the tabernacles. And then when it said Passover, I was like, oh no, I can't believe this. It was supposed to say Feast of Tabernacles. And I got really, really discouraged. But as Rude explains, it's exactly what it should be in the Bible. It was the Feast of Tabernacles, but this is a mistranslation. And it's even a mistranslation in my personal favorite translation, which is Young's literal translation. Even that one says it's Passover, but that is error. It wasn't Passover. It was the Feast of Tabernacles. If you read it as the Feast of Tabernacles, then everything else in the book of John falls together perfectly all the puzzle pieces come together perfectly. So I agree with what Rude is saying, that this is simply one of the many mistranslations that is in the Bible. And, no translation is perfect. So even my favorite Young's Literal has this mistranslation too. Okay, and I've found quite a few mistranslations in the King James Bible, and that's why my favorite is Young's Literal. But this is the second mistranslation I have found in Young's Literal. So no translation is perfect. So then I felt better after learning that it was a mistranslation. So then I went back to my research, and I realized, well, on that same page, that same web page, it said that the one story that's in all the Gospels, the one miracle that's mentioned in all four Gospels, is the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which is the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Okay. Now, because of that fact, you can put all of Jesus' ministry on a timeline, and you can correlate all the stuff that the Gospels say. Now, I want to warn you of one thing. I did notice when I was comparing Matthew to Mark, the books of Matthew to the book of Mark, that some of the stuff is Mark has some of the stories after where Matthew put them. But that's okay, because when it's eyewitness testimony, and especially something that took the course of a year and a half, it would make sense that one person would remember stuff happening first and another person would remember it happening second. But if you look at Luke and John, then Luke and John are like the tiebreakers that show you where everything fell. But one thing that all 4 Gospels agree on is that the miracle of feeding the 5,000 took place. I'm going to finish reading this. We find out that John the Baptist died right before this miracle occurred, and this miracle occurred right before the Feast of Trumpets, which was mistranslated in John 6, where it said the Feast of the Passover, but it was actually the Feast of the Trumpets. John died right before the Feast of Trumpets, which is right after the Passover, I believe. Let me double check. Hold on. Yeah, Feast of Trumpets comes after the Passover. Okay. So the Feast of Trumpets is in what we Gentiles call September, approximately, more or less. It's in September. Okay. So it might be early September, it might be late September, but it's somewhere around there. Okay. So John the Baptist died. Now my question is answered. When John the Baptist died, he died in approximately September, which means that Herod's birthday was also in approximately September. I found a website that said that Herod's birthday was in March, that some scholars claim his birthday was in March. But according to this timeline, Herod's birthday was in September, and that's when John the Baptist died. Okay. And if you correlate all the stories in the gospel, I found that John the Baptist was put in prison in March, which is right around Passover time. And I'm not sure if it's right after Passover or during Passover, but it was around the first Passover of Jesus' ministry. And then in September, 6 months later, John was beheaded. So John was in prison. I've wondered my whole life how long John was in prison and when he died. And now I finally know from doing this research. John was in prison about 6 months, most likely. When I was, before I became saved, I knew that the way the Gospels read, that it was possible that John was in prison for 9 to 11 months, but probably not more than a year. But now I know that it was actually 6 months or less. So I thank Jesus that it's just beautiful to know this information. It doesn't have anything to do with our salvation. You don't have to know about the 70 weeks to be saved. So I'm not trying to say you have to agree with me or else. No, not at all. This is not a tenet of the gospel. So if you don't agree with me or if you don't know this information, that's perfectly fine. But it's just a beautiful beautiful blessing that Jesus shares this with us. And I'm very thankful and very happy that Jesus has shared this with me, but it's not information that you need to be saved. Okay, so moving on. So then I made my own timeline last night, or I might have made it this morning. I can't remember. The Gentiles calendar timeline, because I understand the Gentile calendar. I don't really have a good grip on the Jewish calendar. So I translated it into the months that we go by, in America. So this means that Jesus was baptized around January, February, and he went on the mountain to fast for 40 days in the winter. He was baptized and fasted in the winter. But I've learned from doing a 7-day fast this year that when you're fasting, at some point you're just so tired and kind of numb that you become numb. So even though it was wintertime and Jesus only had his cloak to keep him warm, he might have been numb to the cold. So, and I don't know, it may not have snowed either, but when you haven't eaten for long enough, your body just kind of shuts down in a lot of ways and you don't really feel pain. So, because I know when I only fasted for 7 days, but I was kind of painless. By the middle of the week, I wasn't really feeling much of anything, just going in slow motion. And anyway, so he fasted in the winter time, which is really amazing. Then in March, it was the first Passover in Jesus' ministry, and that was when he overturned the money tables. And this is also around the same time that John the Baptist went to prison. Then in May, June, Jesus said, "Do not say it is 4 months to harvest." That's when he was telling his disciples in John 4:35, "Do not say it is 4 months to harvest. Look around you. It's harvest right now." But he was correlating the physical harvest of the calendar year with a spiritual harvest, saying, don't say we're going to have harvest in 4 months, which is the calendar year harvest. He was saying, we're going to have a spiritual harvest right now. You need to go share the gospel so people can get saved, because we're going to harvest souls, not food. So that was in May, June, which is appropriate for him to say that, because in May, June, it was about 4 months to harvest. So in September, John the Baptist dies just before the Feast of Trumpets. And then also in September, because the Feast of Trumpets is only like a really short time span away from the Feast of Tabernacles. So it was still in September approximately when the Feast of Tabernacles came. And that was when Jesus was transfigured, and Peter, James, and John saw him with Moses and Elijah. And that was when Peter said, "Hey, how about we'll build a tabernacle, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." The reason Peter said this was because the Feast of Tabernacles was only a week away when the transfiguration happened. So Peter already had the Feast of Tabernacles on his mind, and he, in his human infirmity, mental infirmity, thought that maybe Moses and Elijah would like to stick around for the feast, which is pretty cute and funny. But you'll find that in the Gospels, a lot of the things that were said correlate with the Jewish feasts. And this is another thing that was said that correlates with the Jewish feasts, just like when Jesus said, "I'm the light of the world," and it was during Hanukkah when he said that. Okay. So then in December, here we go. Jesus says, "I'm the light of the world," and it's Hanukkah. Of course, that made sense because everybody was lighting their lights for Hanukkah. This is around the same time that Lazarus is raised from the dead. Then in March, the second Passover of Jesus' ministry occurs, in which he becomes the perfect lamb that was slain for the whole world. So he becomes the Passover lamb for the whole world on the second Passover of his ministry, and he died on the cross. Then in April, May comes around again. That's the second April, May of Jesus' ministry, and Jesus is resurrected. And then he appears to hundreds of people during a 40-day time span. So he began his ministry with 40 days of fasting. He ended his ministry with 40 days as a resurrected Jesus, who appeared to many people. And then he leaves, he ascends into heaven around June, the day of, and he tells his disciples to wait for Pentecost, which is only about a week or two away from the point that he ascended. And then the day of Pentecost occurs. And the day of Pentecost is actually the end of Jesus' ministry. His ministry didn't die when it didn't end when he died on the cross. It ended when the Holy Spirit baptized the disciples on the day of Pentecost. That was when Jesus' ministry actually ended. And that is the end of the 70 weeks, which started when Jesus was baptized. So from Jesus' 70 weeks ministry begins when John the Baptist baptized him, and it ends when the Holy Spirit falls down in tongues of fire on the 120 that are waiting for the baptism that Jesus promised them, the baptism of fire. So it's pretty beautiful. And then I did some math last night or the other day. And so I find the baptism and the 40 days of fasting is about 5.71 weeks that begin Jesus' ministry. For 30 days, he traveled to Galilee, Nazareth, Capernaum, and Galilee again until the first Passover in his ministry. And this was about 4.28 weeks. Then Jesus had a year of ministry until the next Passover, which was about 52 weeks for his year of ministry that followed. Then there were 3 days until the resurrection, plus now this is after he was crucified, plus the 40 days to his ascension, plus the waiting of the disciples for the second Pentecost in his ministry, which all took about 5 weeks. So the total time of Jesus' ministry, yes, indeed, it adds up to 70 weeks, which is about 16 months, which is a year and 4 months. So going back to Jesus' hair, his hair grew 8 inches during his ministry time. If you consider the fact that his ministry was 16 months long and the human hair grows about half an inch a month, his hair grew 8 inches from the time of his ministry. So Jesus, who always had short hair, at the beginning of his ministry, stopped cutting it and stopped doing a lot of stuff for himself. And it grew out 8 inches. And the reason that the iconography of Jesus usually shows him with shoulder length hair is because in human nature, we often remember people the last way that we saw them. Now, when Jesus was growing up, people saw him with short hair. And when his ministry began, people saw him with short hair. But in the end of his ministry, in the last few months of his ministry, everywhere people saw him, he always had shoulder length hair. So either just at or just beyond the shoulders. So that's why everybody remembers him that way, is because he died that way and he rose again that way and he ascended that way. And he also, he was at the last Passover that way. So let me see if there's any more slides. Oh, I forgot. There's one more important slide. So anyway, that's pretty amazing. And the nape of your neck is the lowest part of your scalp. Okay. So at the nape of your neck, if your hair is basically all the same length, when like a man's hair is all the same length around his head, pretty much, say his hair was like 3/4 of an inch long or 1 inch long when he started his ministry. Then when it grew out to where it was just past his shoulders, it would be in a V shape in his back, because the nape of your neck, it's going to be longer because it's the lowest point on your scalp. So in behind Jesus' back, he probably had a V shape to his hair. And in the very center of his back was the longest point of his hair. But our pictures of him are always of him from the front. So the hair would be shorter in the front, okay, and on the sides. So it always looks like his hair is just below the shoulders. Okay. Now, there's only one place in the Bible that mentions 70 weeks that I know of, and it's in the book of Daniel. So this shows us that the book of Daniel, when it talks about the 70 weeks in Daniel 9, 24 and 26, it's actually talking about the 70 weeks of Jesus' ministry. Now, the Bible can be read on many different levels. So it's prophesying the ministry of Jesus, but at the same time, it could still be prophesying the destruction of the temple, which a lot of people believe that it is. I don't have a problem with that because the Bible can be read on many different levels. For instance, even when Jesus said, "Do not say it's 4 months to harvest," he was correlating the physical harvest with a spiritual harvest. So he was saying two different things, okay, at the same time. And the Bible often does say two or three different things at the same time. So anyway, the book of Daniel, it might be about the destruction of the temple. It might be about a whole lot of things, but one thing it's definitely about, in addition to whatever else it's about the 70-week ministry of Jesus. So let's read it. 70 weeks are determined for thy people and for thy holy city, that's Jerusalem, to shut up the transgression. Transgression is sin. Okay, shut up means stop. Jesus, because he died on the cross, he stopped sin in our lives so that we don't have to sin anymore. And to seal up sins, again, that's like a stopping. And to cover iniquity, that was his death on the cross to pay the price for our sin. And to bring in righteousness, age during, that's salvation. Age during means for all eternity, and righteousness is what we will all be in heaven, and that's what we are now. If we're following Jesus, we're already righteous. So that's salvation. And to seal up vision and prophet, that means to fulfill all the prophecies about Jesus that are in the Old Testament. And to anoint the Holy of Holies, that is when Jesus' blood literally fell on the mercy seat. And I talked about this in a previous video, but just to recap, Jeremiah, when the Babylonians came and looted Jerusalem, they never found the Ark of the Covenant because Jeremiah had hid the Ark of the Covenant in a cave in Jerusalem. And there's a man named Ron Wyatt who discovered, he's a Christian, but he passed away, and he discovered that Jeremiah had hid the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, and it was happened to be in Golgotha, the Mount of Golgotha, and that was where Jesus was crucified. And so when Jesus' blood dripped down the cross, the hole that the cross was standing in, there was a crack in the hole, and the blood went all the way down into the ark. The Ark of the Covenant was hidden literally under the cross of Jesus, and the blood went down and hit and fell on the mercy seat. So this is talking about anointing the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat, and it was anointed literally with the blood of Jesus. So verse 25, and thou dost know and dost consider wisely from the going forth of the word is Jesus. So from the beginning of his ministry and all the gospel he preached, to restore and to build Jerusalem. Now this doesn't mean a physical building, but this means a spiritual restoration and building. Till Messiah the leader is 7 weeks, and 60 and 2 weeks. Well, 7 weeks plus 62 is 69 weeks, okay? The broad place hath been built again, and the rampart, even in the distress of the times. And again, this is spiritual. Now, you can interpret it as a physical thing too, but it's spiritual. It's also spiritual. This building up is a spiritual building up. This is talking about salvation, the salvation of Jerusalem, the salvation of the world. And verse 26, and after the 60 and 2 weeks, cut off his Messiah. That means that's when they crucified him. And the city and the holy place are not his, because he's not of this world. The leader who hath come doth destroy the people. And that's probably talking about Satan. And its end is with a flood, till the end is war, determined or desolation. So this is talking about Satan being on the rampage until Jesus returns, which he is on a rampage. He has been ever since Jesus ascended. But you'll notice it said after 62 weeks, Jesus is cut off. Well, remember, 62 weeks is the full year of his ministry plus the 40 days. Well, wait a second. Yeah, plus the 40 days of fasting and the 30 days of traveling. So it's about 62 weeks that Jesus was doing the bulk of his ministry before the time that he rose from the grave and was seen by hundreds of people for 40 days, and then Pentecost. So that time, there's about 5 weeks of Pentecost, and I'm not an expert on all the math. I'd have to go over it again to really be perfectly accurate. My estimations are just that. They're estimations. They're not accurate to the day. But the 62 weeks is, it kind of doesn't include the 40 days, okay? And it might not include some other times too. Now, I found a website where they did better math than I did, and they got it all the way down to the day, which their math might not be 100% accurate, but it's better than mine, okay? So they say, how I said that Jesus was baptized January, February? They say it would have been February 13th exactly, okay? And then they added up all the other stuff, and Messiah shall be cut off right here. They claim the 3 days of him being in the belly of the earth was not included in the 7 weeks. I don't have a problem with that. And 10 days leading up to Pentecost ends the 70 weeks, which they claim is June 20th. Okay? I don't have a problem with that because that still fits in with my timeline too. It's just that their timeline is more detailed. So if you really want to be detailed, Jesus got baptized about February 13th. Then a whole year passed, and then another 4 months, and the day of Pentecost fell on June 20th. And that was the end of the 70 weeks. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, and I hope you're blessed by it. And I thank Jesus for sharing that with me. And again, you might want to do your own research because your research might be better than mine, but that's just what I came up in the few days that I was looking up all this stuff. But yes, indeed, Jesus' ministry was 70 weeks long. The 70 weeks in Jeremiah are speaking about the ministry of Jesus. And Jesus definitely loves all of us. And so I think that's why he wanted us to know this. He just wants us to know the truth, and not be believing a whole bunch of fairy tales that we get taught in church. He wants us to believe the truth. But again, this isn't really a point of salvation. So if you don't understand this yet and you're not ready to accept it yet, that's okay, because it's not a point of salvation. So God bless you.